In this presentation, we take the opportunity to consider and reflect on our characterization of children's lives as we emerge from the pandemic that has dominated our lives for a year. Children attending schools and preschools worldwide have had their education disrupted and relocated into their homes. While this has been referred to as homeschooling, it has been very different to the existing construct of homeschooling, which has been conducted by parents who have made conscious choices not to participate in traditional schooling systems. Teachers have provided content and instructions for completion of activities online and set up meetings for children to participate in together so that they are able to keep in touch with their peers while in their COVID lockdowns. There has been a concern expressed about children missing out on schooling, and this has mostly been related to missing out on content not being taught, rather than worrying about the social interactions and the associated well-being implications. What is clearly evident from the type of tasks being given to school-age children is that traditional learning moved online, with bookwork and sheets becoming electronic and heritage curriculum being maintained. The affordances of new technologies to be able to do this made it easy, of course. But there hasn't been a shift in new and transformative pedagogies as we emerge out of the pandemic and children in Australia have been back at school for a term, 10 weeks long. It seems as if we are right back to where we started. In thinking about new technologies and young children, contemporary early childhood research focuses a great deal on supporting early learning in home, school, and communities. Here, we attempt to build on this research and embrace the wholeness of children's digital worlds and offer a contextualized discussion for how to engage and support children with new technologies that are a part of early childhood pedagogical practices. This requires engaging in educational as well as sociological and anthropological discussions and research. We attempt to interrogate the miscellaneous interlinking elements that are apparent in young children's digital learning landscapes by considering the ways in which new technologies connect with contemporary educational practices and modalities. We seek to consider how we can reconceptualize identities, position, place, and agency in children's increasingly complex multimodal life worlds that incorporate digital materials. Some of the research to date has studied the pedagogies that enable learning with new technologies, comparisons between the home and school use of these new technologies, what constitutes digital play and how young children play with various digital artifacts, and the changing nature of literacy in the 21st century to incorporate multiliteracies. By embracing the complexities and multiplicities of children's multimodal life worlds, which involves young children in meaning making using digital artifacts and also a consideration of visual, embodied, oral and oral modalities so that they are able to understand their worlds, we begin from an alternative perspective which incorporates a growing array of innovative digital resources to explore social and cultural artifacts. In thinking about the implications of using new technologies with young children, there are various things that come to the fore. There continues to be a panic, which has been exacerbated throughout the pandemic, about the amount of time young children spend on screen as opposed to the quality of the things that they are doing with new technologies in these digital worlds. What has been happening is there has been a binary position of either being for young children using new technologies or the alternative of no technology at all. In terms of multimodalities, we have come to recognize the importance of using the range of modalities that are available in terms of being linguistic, visual, oral, and embodied or kinesthetic, both with and without new technologies. We've come to understand more how these can support young children's meaning making in new and vital ways. This has required a reconsideration of children's habitus. Here we draw on the term habitus from Pierre Bourdieu, and we extend it by suggesting that it refers to the patterns of behavior and the learning ecologies that occur in young children's taken for granted everyday worlds and everyday practices. So habitus disposes them to specific actions and without having to think about them. And for young children, moving in and out of digital and non-digital worlds is a very important part of their habitus.
Throughout a lot of the work that I do, I'm really interested in creativity, whether that's with technology or not. And so one of the frameworks or the kind of conceptualizations that really helped informed my thinking and our thinking in this project was Anna Craft's work, and her colleagues as well. This idea of possibility thinking and her understanding of creativity. And within that discussion, she has a really nice body of work around childhood in the digital age, which I really, really like. And it really helps me understand, the key characteristics that shape children's experiences. So she talks about this notion of kind of viewing children as empowered and capable and confident to shape their own futures, to manage their own digital lives and to make decisions, or perhaps with support and scaffolding from parents and practitioners, but understanding that they are in a position to negotiate and navigate that journey, or positioning children in a position of being at risk and therefore needing protection. And that is where we see this notion of shutting down children's access to particular resources for fear of damage or concern over their well-being. And so I very much stem from that sort of empowerment angle. I mean, I know it's fraught with challenge, but I work from that perspective that in early childhood, it's always about supporting children to make decisions, to lead their learning. And so we're not leaving them to do that in isolation, but we are supporting children through that journey where they are key in shaping their own futures. And so that, I think, is the same with technology. And so I really like Anna Craft's work. And one of the parts that is really helpful for us is this notion of the 4 Ps, and she talks about plurality of identity, possibility awareness, playfulness of engagement, and participation. All of that, I think, is significant when we think about how children navigate their multimodal life worlds. And we will talk later in the presentation about things like plurality of identity. She talks here about places and people and activities. And we're going to talk about sort of the digital and the non-digital, embodied and digital identities. So I think this is a really helpful lens to start thinking about childhood and how that childhood is transforming and evolving to be one that is multimodal. When we start to think about multimodal life worlds and what that means for contemporary childhood, it's a really helpful phrase or conceptualization. For us, it moves beyond that idea of technology or digital technologies being a discrete artifact or resource that is in practice, but is sort of somehow disconnected from early childhood pedagogy. We know, for example, in Scotland, technologies become one element of the curriculum. They have their own focus in the curriculum, and often that means they become timetabled activities, or they become a separate activity for children to engage in practice. For the longest time, there was the computer area. When you had desktop computers, there was a computer area, there was the interactive whiteboard area, and the more mobile technologies weren't always integrated in children's experiences. iPads and tablets, for example, are available in early childhood settings, but most of the time they are still used by practitioners for documentation purposes and not necessarily a free device or artifact for children to use. So what we wanted to start thinking about, well, actually in broader society, that connection or that link between technology and life and living and learning is much more integrated in homes and in culture. it's much more fluid how we progress between digital and non-digital experiences, and there's lots of research now from people like Jackie Marsh who are starting to explore these concepts of the entanglement of technologies with everyday non-technology related life. So for us, multimodal life world is a helpful conceptualization to kind of bring that focus into the fore, to start thinking about technologies as one modality in early childhood practice and in early childhood life and living and learning, because it is one resource that children are engaging with to make meaning. It is not a designated or separate activity that is disjointed from learning. It's still part of the learning process, it's still part of the cultural process, and it's embedded. So the multimodal life world is a holistic term to try and consider how new devices, whether that's digital or non-screen based devices or internet connected toys or wherever it might be, how all of these artifacts have meaning in children's lives, and how children interact with these variety of artifacts as part of their everyday life and as part of their learning process.
So we're coming to recognize children's life worlds as being increasingly multimodal. They have learning resources which include a wide range of artifacts. Their identities are plural. They have digital and non-digital identities that they are able to switch between. And this requires transformative pedagogies to encourage multimodal play so that young children can have an authentic engagement in their learning ecologies.
One of the things that has been really interesting for us when we started to think about this conceptualization of multimodal life worlds is this notion of embodied and digital identities that children are living through and developing through. And it's no different than an adult. Of course, an adult also has this embodied identity that they project in their sort of physical world, but they also have a digital identity, a digital self, which are very carefully chosen in most cases, or perhaps not. There will be some adults that perhaps don't put a lot of thought about what they are sharing online, but there will be some adults who are very carefully sort of curating the image that they present for themselves online, and they are creating a separate identity almost online than they are in person. And children also have to navigate that realm, that world where they are balancing their physical 3D embodied self with their digital footprint, their digital identity, their digital self. And some of this discussion is taking place, at very, very young ages now. Parents are creating a digital profile for their young children almost from birth, or perhaps pre-birth, when they are documenting, baby scans and all of these kind of things. That is a footprint that is created for that child before they're even born. And so they've already got this embodied and digital identity to navigate. And at some point in their lives, they have to start taking ownership of that, and they have to transition from having their parent create this environment or this identity for them by proxy, to them taking control of their digital identity and making key decisions about what does this mean for me as a person, and in terms of my own story that I want to project online versus the story I want to project in person. So that was really interesting for us to start thinking about how these identities form. And it's not always going to be as straightforward as issues like sharenting and those kind of discussions that are already widely available in the literature. It might be something much more nuanced. It might be how we understand technologies as part of culture and as part of play. So we've got some data now that talks about role play with technologies. For example, I've got a chapter that looks at how children engage with toys in a role play setting, and how they might engage in imagination, for example. And some of that comes down to non-working technologies and how you observe children in their play incorporating digital devices into their play in really culturally sensitive ways. They're reproducing the culture that they're seeing from their parents and their grandparents, and reimagining the future based on what their understanding of a digital identity might look like. So that's really, really interesting, because we start to see how the role of technology is really entangled in everyday life and practice. It's not just about times when we're using devices physically. Sometimes it's this idea of being constantly connected. In our heads and in our imagination and in our play, we are constantly connected to something or to someone or to a being that is intangible behind a computer screen, behind a mobile phone, even if that mobile phone is not working. So that was really exciting for us to kind of think through these concepts. And of course, we don't have all the answers, and we're not suggesting that we do. But I think in terms of conceptualizing global childhoods and contemporary childhoods, that is one thing we do need to factor in. What is the impact of technology on young children's play and on young children's identities? And how is it shifting? How are children navigating perhaps this dual identity of an embodied and a digital identity is really, really important. And how does all of that impact on their voice and their ability to make decisions and their agency, and how they are represented, how they want to be represented in the wider society in both of those concepts. So we think that's really, really important to consider. We talked about this idea that technology has become one modality amongst many, and that was really helpful for us when we were working with practitioners in our research projects, because we started to see how we can move beyond segregated or separate digital activities that tick a box for the digital curriculum or the technology curriculum, or whatever it might be, and we can start to see how a wide range of resources allow children or provide and facilitate children in seeing things differently, having a different view of the world that might not have been possible before. So this example is when we had digital microscopes, and they were just this kind of almost egg-shaped resource, and it was a Wi-Fi connected resource, so there was no cables or anything, and there was no viewfinder, so you couldn't look through the microscope. But when you placed the microscope on top of an object, an image appeared on the iPad, and a really zoomed in image. And these are some of the images that children in nursery took with this digital microscope. And what you then see is a really easy, accessible, sort of child-friendly, if you want to use that phrase. I know it can be challenging for some people, but a really accessible artifact that children can use to have a different perspective on the world. So technologies are not always just about computer games or YouTube or whatever the learning technology, the ed tech technology might be. Simple technologies that have advanced to allow children to have a different perspective on the world are really, really helpful, and they need to be included in our understanding and in our definition of what we mean by technology. We can't always talk about screen-based media, although this is connected to a screen. The screen merely does the projection for us. It allows us to zoom in and to see things in detail, but the actual device itself is a handheld, tactile device that children can place on an object, and they can really zoom in close and see the fine-grained details of something and how it looks completely different when using a new multimodal resource. And the practitioners talked about how wonderful this resource was, because it really opened up possibilities for technology use in practice that wasn't separated out, wasn't linked to one particular curricular area or one particular zone. You didn't have to be within a particular space within the nursery, so they could use this inside, they could use it outside, and it was very, very mobile and allowed discussions and collaborations. So they talked about how children used the resource and took turns picking objects to look at, but how all the children gathered around the iPad to look at the final resource, the final photograph, and talked about what they saw. So it was this kind of collaborative artifact where it instilled communication and discussion, but it also provided freedom and flexibility for the pedagogy, which we know and love in early childhood, to really shine through in a technological context. It wasn't always about shifting the pedagogy to match what the technology needed us to do. In this case, the technology really fitted in with that discovery, inquiry-based exploration, which is so common and so valued in early childhood education. Things that have become really, really significant for us in this work is this idea of multimodal play and the sheer variety and contrast that is evident in children's play. I talked previously about imagination and how role play, for example, with technologies or non-working technologies are reimagining and reproducing culture. And you see that with the examples of data we've got in the chapters and the papers that we've presented, that children are reproducing, for example, their online world that they're viewing. So children watching YouTube are then incorporating what it means and what it feels like to be a vlogger in their play, and they're perhaps using, you know, cameras and video recording devices to record their everyday lives. They're doing it with an American accent because that's what they associate with that life, with that reality, is that if you're a vlogger, you're quite often American. You know, they're sharing and narrating their stories in the same way that they would watch other children and families and co-creators of digital media on YouTube doing so. And that's really, really interesting because you can see very much that the children are experimenting and exploring and playing with this idea of having this digital identity that we talked about earlier, alongside their embodied identity. And sometimes it's different. You know, they put on this alternative accent online, which they don't use in the nursery or in the home, because that's part of their digital identity. It's something that's quite separate. So it's really helpful to unpick some of these observations that we've had in terms of play. We've also started to think about the emotional connection that children are having with these resources. We have, in another project we've been working on with other colleagues, we talked about internet connected devices and robotics toys, and how children really became connected to these devices. We had one boy who borrowed the Cosmo learning robot for a couple of weeks, and when he went back to nursery, there's a video that his parents have sent in of him being really sad and upset that he's lost his friend. And he talked about in this video how he loved Cosmo and he just missed him and he was his friend. So there's huge debates about those connections that children are making with different devices. And it's something that's worth unpicking, because we don't question children making connections with teddy bears or objects that look having sort of human resemblance, but for some reason we have this concern with children making connections with robotics toys. And I'm not saying that they should or they shouldn't. I'm not providing an answer here, but it's something interesting to think about, how play has become multimodal and how all of these elements of identity and emotion and representation all become really, really key in children's play experiences.
So, in this presentation, we've explored young children's digital learning ecologies and explained how they are multimodal. We believe this perspective can act as a mechanism to support the framing of early childhood digital practices that go beyond just a consideration of the materials or artifacts. Given the increased agentic possibilities for young children facilitated by connectivity and more user-friendly devices that enable their creativity, we suggest children's multimodal life worlds can balance a range of conceptual interpretations of digital or multimodal life worlds, since they are fluid and will shift as children inhabit varying learning ecologies.
So this sort of jigsaw model is what we came up with a few years ago now, about what elements of practice and of pedagogy and of children's experiences need to be considered before we can start thinking about what pedagogies for multimodal life worlds can look like. We very much want to think about multimodal play inquiries and exploration, so that idea that, you know, technology and devices are not one segregated part of the curriculum, it's not one segregated part of the playroom or the home, but actually an integrated approach where children are engaging with exploration and inquiry that shapes their experiences, their learning and their meaning making. So for us, these are the key concepts that stand out and that we need to think about. You know, simple things like, well, defining what do we mean by multimodality, defining what we mean by technology, and what we mean by digital. All of those concepts are really, really key. also this understanding that, you know, learning and meaning making happens within this ecology, this broad understanding of the pedagogic culture, which is dynamic and transformational, is really, really important. And that notion of children has having agency and a say in their decision making, in shaping both their embodied and their sort of digital and multimodal lives, is really, really key. So there may be other elements that we've missed, and this is not a comprehensive or exhaustive list, but this is the starting point for us. These were the things that came out in the literature and in our research data that seemed to be significant when we were thinking about children's multimodal life worlds, and inquiries which were exploratory and play-based when using these resources. So we hope if you find it helpful, but as I say, we're still developing and evolving in this process.